Hi, everyone. Hope you guys are doing well. My name's Laura Mistretta. I am a member of Rights and Democracy. I serve on the leadership committee, which helps provide some strategic direction to the organization, and we're all volunteers from across the state that give our feedback to staff and really help move the organization in the way, members want to see it go. So I'm here to just give a brief introduction to Rights and Democracy and welcome you to our lovely office space. As you can see, we are a very multi-issue organization. If you kind of take a peek at the posters on the walls, whether you've already kind of looked at them or later, it's pretty incredible the variety of issues that Rights and Democracy is tackling in the state of Vermont and New Hampshire. And that's honestly one of the things that I love most about Rights and Democracy. I've been an organizer and an activist ever since college. And in Vermont, Rights and Democracy has really become my activist home because at the end of the day, we really see that so many of these issues are interconnected. And being able to discuss variety of issues at a time and have access to action on a variety of issues at a time is just, I find, really fulfilling and exciting. Rights and Democracy has also been great about supporting members' kind of individual action ideas and, being in solidarity with other movements. Having this meeting here, RAD helped me pull together some environmental justice work that we've also been continuing with other partners. But fundamentally, Rights and Democracy is really about putting the power back in the hands of the people, which is very related to what you guys are here to talk about tonight. The main way that RAD's focusing the resources and time is around economic justice issues. So right now in Vermont, fighting the good fight to really do our best to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour by 2024. Looks like there's been some potentially exciting progress. We'll see how it goes in the next couple of weeks of the session, but Governor Scott says he's open to it now, so that's cool. And then also really been focusing on paid family medical leave. So again, kind of the idea that for our society to be strong, we really need to make sure that all of us are strong and supported and have the power and resources we need to live the lives we deserve. Yeah, that's really like the gist of it, I'd say. Again, Rights and Democracy is a member-led and supported organization. So if you'd want to find out more about that, we've got organizing chapters here in Burlington, across the state, also in New Hampshire. So if you'd want to stay involved with Rights and Democracy, you totally can. More information on the website, or feel free to talk to Shay. He's the communications director back there. Or I am going to stick around for a little while. Not sure I'll make it till the end, but if I do, you can talk to me too. So yeah, thanks for being here, and I'm excited to hear what this is all about tonight. If you're next.
Oh, all right. Yeah, so my name is Robyn Lloyd. I'm with Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and we are co-sponsoring this with RAD. And I'm sort of excited that Move to Amend called me, I don't know, about a month ago and asked whether I would help to pull this meeting together because we had worked very hard on this it was 5 years ago, 2014. And in fact, I looked in my email list, and I first got a communication from Greg Coleridge, who I've never met until today, concerning the monetary history calendar. And this was part of a study group that some of us in WILF had done back in 2014 to understand how Citizens United could have, how the Supreme Court could have passed such a ruling that seemed to us so perverse to actually democracy in America. And I think, as Greg will tell us, it goes way back to 1886 or something, where decisions were made that started to give more power to the elites than to the people. So at that time we worked, we had a study group program on corporations, law, and democracy called POCLAD, and a bunch of us worked on that, and Greg was involved in putting that together on the national level, and was also program director for economic and political justice with the American Friends Service Committee. But before Greg speaks, Jenny Lyons is going to say a few words about what's happening in Vermont, or what has happened in Vermont, because she was involved with us back in those days to really publicize what was going on in terms of how our elections were being corrupted by corporations. So, Jenny, please.
Okay, thanks.
Say a few words.
Oh, money is not speech. I forgot. Okay. So, yeah. But that's exactly what the Citizens United did to us. It replaced free speech with corporate donations to political campaigns. So I'm just going to say a couple of words. I'm going to read something, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done here in Vermont. And I know some of you worked with us after the Citizens United decision was handed down, and it was frightening, really frightening. So let me read this. Democracy and transparency in the wake of Citizens United. We know that the framers of the U.S. Constitution intended that constitutional rights be granted to individuals, to the people, a democratic government of, by, and for the people. The First Amendment guarantees free speech and a free press. The Supreme Court on January 21st, 2010, in its Citizens United decision, equated free speech with corporate spending on political campaigns. While the economy might benefit from business success, democracy benefits when individual voices are heard. Democracy is forever altered when corporate economic power can silence individual votes and voices within the democratic process. By allowing corporations to give unlimited dollars to political campaigns to market positive or negative political ads, the Supreme Court undermines our democratic heritage. The unfettered infusion of money into the electoral process has led to a loss of transparency so important to our open elections. A local resolution can level the playing field for Vermonters, one town at a time. I read that when we were working with towns across the state to build a resolution asking our state legislature to pass a resolution and send that to Congress to initiate an Article 5 constitutional convention. We did pass that. The resolution urges our state and federal elected officials to return the Constitution to the people, to designate persons as individuals, removing personhood from corporations, and in so doing, the intent of the Constitution will be fulfilled. Citizens United should be rebuked. Corporate money can be regulated during elections, and people's voices can be heard during the electoral process. Both bring justice and transparency back to the democratic process. So in Vermont, in 2011, we introduced that resolution. It was passed, and I'm trying to remember, Robyn and I are trying to remember what year it was passed. It was 2012 or 2013. It was the first, we were the first state in the nation to ask to have a change to the Constitution so that we could move forward with what we believe is democracy, and that is the individual voice. So it wasn't long after that Senator Leahy, as chair of the Judicial Committee, worked to try to have some type of constitutional amendment. It wasn't long after that that Senator Sanders introduced Democracy is for People, a constitutional amendment that is still lying on the table. So we have an opportunity to have that happen again. But you know, the voices have quieted down, and I'm really glad that Greg is here. I don't know how many states have now introduced a proposal or resolution. It takes, what, 38?
You need two-thirds.
Two-thirds.
Of Congress.
Two-thirds.
And three-quarters.
And three-quarters of
to
states.
ratify.
And two-thirds of Congress. So Congress could actually declare a constitutional convention, or we could have an Article 5 conversation and propose a constitutional amendment to Congress. That should happen. In this state, I think it's important that we continue the work that we've been doing, but unfortunately, it's really hard for a single state to put in place restrictions on campaign finance. We do that, and we've tried to do that. And some of us have refused to accept large corporate donations. But that's just our state, and it still doesn't eliminate the amount of money that's coming in for ads and influencing our campaigns. We've had a number of meetings with Lawrence Lessig, and I think many of you know who he is, who has written several books about the issue around Lesters and Lesterland and the elimination of Citizens United, trying to change that decision. The Bar Association had a continuing education program on Citizens United and supported the work that we were doing. And right now, Mitch McConnell has said that any attention to Citizens United is really a political game or a political gimmick for elections. I don't call it a political gimmick. What I'm seeing is the corporations are ruining our government. The EPA is overrun, the Department of Energy is overrun, the Agency of the Health and Human Services is overrun, and it's time for us to speak up. Whatever we do in this state is critically important. We have passed the popular vote in this state, and so when more states also pass a law endorsing popular vote, I think that will bring people's voices to the fore. But we can't do that unless we also limit the amount of money that's being put into campaigns and into elections. It's very important that we change the complexion in Congress. It's very important, and in particular in the Senate, as you know. So I just brought this along to show you, beside the speech I gave with the $5 bill, this is the resolution that we passed, and you were one of the leaders with us. It was great. We got many towns to convince our legislators to pass it. It wasn't easy, because when people start saying, oh, corporations are not people, then people feel that that's a bad business message. That's a good business message. So it's also a message for democracy. I'm not going to say any more. We've done a great deal of work in this state. It's really, really critical that all of us continue to ask our congressional delegation to make changes, both structural and functional, non-structural changes at the federal level, to change what's going on in Congress. So I have a list of those things, but I bet Greg will probably talk about them in a greater detail than I would. But certainly, it ranges, the conversation might range from limiting term limits to having representatives and senators enter into Social Security and be responsible for their own health care, being paid only when they're in session. So there are a lot of things that we could talk about. But I'm going to stop there. And I am really thrilled to meet Greg. I met his predecessor when he was here. And I know that you're ready to share a lot with us, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Maybe I'll just remove this because it's ugly, or are you going to?
No, it works,
You're
yeah.
going to put it on there?
There's actually something shorter than I am here. So.
Yeah, that works. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Just want to thank very much RAD, I guess I should speak into this, for co-sponsoring this along with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, outstanding organizations. And WILP in particular is a group that I became connected with through my connection to this outfit that I think Robyn mentioned, the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, a mouthful that I'll say something about in a minute.
Could you just introduce yourself?
Yes, so my name is Greg Coleridge. I'm the outreach director for this outfit called Move to Amend. How many people here have heard about before tonight, Move to Amend? All right, a few folks, great, wonderful. An organization that began the very day of the Citizens United decision way back in 2010. And this is a group made up of, I guess you could say, frustrated activists, much like the POCLAD group was that I became involved with. And just giving a real quick background as to how it is I came to be here this evening, other than this kind invitation from Robyn and sponsorship by RAD and all. This chap here in the front row, Dan Toll, and I were students at a place in Ohio called Oberlin College. And it was there that I first sort of became involved in political ventures, was sort of a student nader-raider, connected to the on-campus group of PIRG, Public Interest Research Group, which was in Ohio, so it was called OPIRG. And that was a good government-type group that was trying to do some good political reform. And at the time I was there, the big issues were trying to get a bottle bill passed statewide. And second, we're really working on campus to try to get the college to divest from its investments in South Africa. Remember, Coke sweetens apartheid, that sort of whole thing. And it was a big battle for the entirety. And that's when I first became really aware of corporate power, but not corporate rights. Distinction there. So I wasn't really aware of corporations having inalienable constitutional rights that were intended exclusively solely for human beings. So here I go to this school that's considered to be one of the most lefty schools out there, right? And yet I learned nothing about this while I was there. Now, I don't know what that really says about whether it's the school or whether it's part of the larger culture, the larger narrative. The fact that this whole issue area, which was very much a topic of conversation several generations ago, had been buried. You know what they say, history is always written by the winners. Well, the corporate crowd a century ago kind of won over the populists and managed to crush and eliminate and bury that whole history of what the relationship was between people and corporations, and how what's happening today is not inevitable, it's not irreversible, it's not like the tides coming in and out, or the swans coming back at Capistrano, or all of these things that we deem to be inevitable. Cleveland having lousy sports teams, those sorts of inevitabilities. That this was intentional and deliberate. And just as things have been done intentionally and deliberately, they can be undone if you come to believe and know that what has happened has been intentional and deliberate. And I didn't come to understand that until after I got out of college. One of the groups I sort of volunteered with, sort of on campus, that the OPIRG group used to connect with, was this organization called the American Friends Service Committee. Don't know if any of you have heard of that group. A Quaker social action organization that I worked for 34 years in Northeast Ohio, doing all of those sort of conventional types of education, advocacy, and organizing on justice, peace. We even dabbled in environmental issues, trying to close down a radioactive Superfund landfill south of Akron, between Akron and Canton. and being involved in humanitarian concerns. And maybe you can't tell or not, but sort of the left side of my head is flatter than the right side. And that has to do because I kept pounding my head against the wall time after time after time as a result of trying to work on these issues, one at a time, believing that we could solve, trying to stop this war, trying to create one form of economic justice or another about budget priorities, housing, rehab, more funding for low, moderate income, raising the minimum wage, all of these sorts of concerns that we did pitch battles with and would make kind of a marginal bit of difference, but at some point was kind of thwarted and didn't really know why we weren't able to get, maybe we were able to get to first base, sports metaphor, but certainly never able to circle the bases. Why was that? And, just sort of couldn't figure that out until I was invited by a friend of mine who used to be a council person on Toledo, Ohio City Council, who was going to attend this sort of weekend retreat of this group made up of, like me, frustrated activists with one side of their head flatter than the other side. And this group was called POCLAD, the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, made up of people involved in labor concerns, environmental concerns, peace and justice concerns, environmental concerns, each of whom had been doing the traditional forms of educating, and each had realized that they were getting nowhere fast, and that something fundamental was happening. There was why they and we were getting nowhere fast and consistently and persistently. And that was because of the power, not just economic power, but governing power, the right to rule, the right to decide, the right to, no pun intended, trump democratically enacted laws and regulations that we the people at the local level, at the state level, even at the federal level, had passed, because these entities had acquired these things called constitutional rights. And so got invited to this weekend workshop called Rethink Democracy, Rethink the Corporation, and it was one of, as you may hear, maybe you've experienced in your own life, one of these aha experiences. Like, you know what? Now some of this shit is starting to make sense. Now I'm starting to figure out why it's been so long that, in so many ways, that we weren't getting far enough, fast enough in bringing about any sort of substantial change. And what we learned in that event, and during that couple of days, where a guy named Richard Grossman, the founder of POCLAD, and Jane Ann Morse, a corporate anthropologist, figure that one out. It's kind of cool. Sort of looking at the culture of the corporation. And her website, still great website, is democracythemepark.org. Check it out, democracythemepark.org. Because to her and to us, that's what it is. It's a theme park. Kind of like, when you walk down, if you've been to theme parks, it sort of looks like Main Street until you kind of walk around the back and you see the whole thing is held up by 2x4s. So that's kind of what democracy is. You go into a voting booth and you push things, pull things, things light up, something gets punched out maybe, but is it really connected to anything that substantively, in the end, matters? A little bit, yeah, but not as it should be, not as it was intended to be, not as we supposedly learn about these things in Government 101, okay, or 201 or 301. So that was a real eye-opening experience, and came back and decided from there that we needed to dig deep and begin the process of trying to understand how we got into this fix. And the fix that these folks at this weekend retreat were talking about was that this whole notion of we the people having the power to decide was hijacked by corporate entities by going to the courts and perverting what had been a power of we the people to decide our creations. And that's what corporations are. They're creations of the state. Individuals who want to form a corporation come together, go to the state, fill out some paperwork, and voila, they become a corporation with many of the protections and a good deal of, some people would say rights associated with them in the present sense. But that's not how it was intended to be. how it was intended to be was that corporations were deemed to be subordinate, deemed to be less than equal to people. We were in charge. We did the defining, we did the authorizing, we did the dictating, and the vehicle for doing that was this thing called a charter, which is akin to, I don't know if anyone here is a professional person that requires a license to do business or to practice. Anybody here like that? Okay. So if you are like that, let me just take a wild guess, you're teachers. Yeah, okay. So as teachers, you have to have a certain kind of code, right, to adhere. And that is something you sign up for. And if you follow those precepts and ideals and conditions, you can continue. And you got to get, up and do your CE. One of those things called CEO, no.
Professional development.
Professional development. You got to keep up your just to maintain your professionalism. And if you don't do those things, or if you violated the basic terms, that license is taken away. And so here, the idea was that the state, the government, we the people, we are the ones who define and decide what the terms are going to be for teachers, lawyers, doctors, and the like to practice in the state. That's what a corporate charter was intended to be. A democratically defining document to say that, yes, we are going to allow a group of people to come together and form a business to, make a table, a chair, create a road, make a fair profit, those kinds of things. Fine. Excellent. That's something that you can do better than the state can do. But there's going to be certain limitations, certain responsibilities associated with that. And basically, in almost every case, and certainly that was true in a place like Vermont, as well as my state of Ohio, those charters included limitations of how long that company could have that license or charter before it was either re-upped or expired. That charter included the necessary conditions or necessary materials to put together a table or a chair or a road, and nothing more. So you couldn't acquire assets that were way beyond what was necessary for fear that you were trying to maybe monopolize that industry. And that charter included, things like if you were a bank, can't imagine why there would be concerns about banks. I don't know why. That interest rates would be limited to a certain amount. So the bank itself could not decide what the interest rates was. That was listed in the charter. And for whatever reason, in many state charters across the country, corporations couldn't be involved in charitable activities. Charity was something that we the people did, or the state did, not corporate entities. The fear was that individuals or entities might become too dependent, too beholden to those, and therefore lose that sense of independence. Very important. If one is trying to pursue interests of democracy or sovereignty or self-governance or self-determination or right to decide or whatever adjective you want to use to describe the sense of those who have or should have the right to decide are those who should be involved in decisions shaping their lives. So that was a basic concept of these early charters in places like Vermont and many states in the country. But that all changed. That all changed when corporations began to flex their democratic, or anti-democratic, I should say, muscles in response to the democratic muscle flexing of we the people at the state level in defining and determining and deciding what these corporations can and cannot do. Oh, and by the way, charters oftentimes, if not most of the time, prohibited money from being spent in elections. You can't buy, rent, lease, or retain public officials. I can't quite figure out which one it is, maybe all of the above. So there was this sense that we, the sovereign people, were sovereign and in charge. And those creations of ours were subordinate. Seemed fair enough. That relationship was one of we are the deciders. You agree, if you care to form a company and you agree to these terms, fine, you can do your business, create a useful good and service, but you're not going to be equal to us. You're not going to be in the political realm trying to negotiate with us or trying to outrun us or trying to outmaneuver us or trying to influence us. That's just not in the cards. That's not something that we are going to permit. So that was not a given. That was not a default. And so that which we hear today about, well, the best we can do is maybe limit the influence of corporate power in elections or in other ways. The best we can do is maybe, I don't know, have greater transparency so we know how much money is being used against us. Instead of prohibiting that, let's at least know, it's sort of akin to knowing the amount of poisons that are in the food we're eating, right? Let's not try to eliminate the poisons in the food. Let's just at least know what poisons are in the food. That's sort of how I think much about the whole thing about transparency. It's better than not knowing, but comparatively, it's not fully, authentically democratic. If we are going to be true and authentic, self-governing people, then we should have the ability to not just regulate, but to prohibit if we think something is harmful. So that is a very long kind of backdrop to, I think, provide a context as to where we have come. And there's a lot more to that. And it's extremely important in these days, and are we not in these days, whereas people who are like, I'm sure all of you, because why on earth would anyone other than people who are really involved and concerned about issues and the state of the world on a Friday evening be here listening to me when you could be doing something a whole heck of a lot more fun? I mean, that shows that you really do care and that you really believe that something fundamentally does need to change. And something fundamentally does need to change. And that's why this outfit called Move to Amend got going the day of the Citizens United decision. And I should say, this nifty little timeline of personhood rights and powers is something that was put together by a couple of organizations led by, I should say, WILF. You can go to our website, movetoamend.org, and there's sort of a search bar, and if you just put in timeline of personhood rights, this will come up. But that second piece that you have that I handed out is sort of the summary of it, Cliff Notes version, if you will, that I'm going to get to in a minute. But before doing that, I just wanted to share with you a little bit about Move to Amend and why we think it's important, particularly in these days, and particularly among people who, like you, care about what's going on. To care about what's going on requires and necessitates that we do respond, react, and resist. And there's a whole heck of a lot of responding, reacting, and resisting to what's going on, particularly when we are not in charge, when we are not seated around the table. What do they say? If you're not seated around the table, you're probably then on the menu. And that's probably a very accurate description of the fate and the state of so many people, so many neighborhoods, and so many communities in this state, across the country, if not around the world. Too many people are on the menu, are being oppressed, victimized by the decisions by a very small number of people who are making those decisions to benefit them and their friends, and maybe their investors or donors, and probably, maybe their family, but almost nobody else. Almost nobody else. And that is causing not only problems economically, but socially, politically, constitutionally, and certainly ecologically. And unless we turn this thing around mighty fast, we are doomed. And that's not to be melodramatic, I don't believe. I think that is, if anything, it's probably understated. Okay. So how do we do that? What do we do? Well, we can't only respond, react, and resist. Because to only respond, react, or resist is to be totally and constantly on the defense. And I don't know about you, but I don't like to constantly be on the defense, trying to plug holes in the dike, trying to pull people out from downstream, trying to save people out from burning buildings. I want to find out why in the heck that dam wasn't built correctly to begin with. How are those people getting into the river to begin with? Who are the arsonists? That's what we need to be focused on. And to do that, one needs to be proactive, to not only oppose, but to propose, to put those guys and gals, both individuals, the super duper wealthy, and those in charge of these artificial legal fictions that we call corporations, we need to put them on the defensive by reflexing our democratic muscles, or maybe authentically doing it for the very first time. Because if you look at this timeline, it has here about the Constitution, and the Constitution, what this is timeline. Above the line is corporations gain or lose rights and powers. Below, people gain or lose rights and powers. And the Constitution here actually says it's actually above the line, because the premise here is that if you really dig deep and you do a little of the analysis, you'll discover, okay, it gets a pretty good start. The Constitution does. The first 3 words of the preamble being,
We the people.
not a bad start. Not a bad start. But when you continue to read, there's some pretty good things about it, but there's some problematic things about it. And one of them that we feel, focusing as we do on the topic of people and personhood and rights, is to ask ourselves, who was a person at the time of the original Constitution? Who was a person?
White male.
White, male,
Landowner.
property owners. That's right. Which, in the times of Occupy here in recent days, that whole meme of 99% and 1%, well, it wasn't quite 1% white male property owners back then. It was more like 5 to 8%. So 5 to 8% had 100% basic inalienable rights. Women, well, women are just the ribs of men. That's right. They had no inherent inalienable rights. Slaves or people of color were enslaved. They were, for purposes of the Electoral College, 3/5 of a person, right? Native people, indigenous people, if you look at some of our glorious founders, you read some of their grisly comments, they weren't even 1/5 of a person. They were considered beasts. And that word was used, beasts. So there was a real problem in terms of this thing about personhood back in the day. But they did get right to this notion of corporations being something. The word corporation is not mentioned in the Constitution. Okay? It's not there at all anywhere. That whole thing of rights, inalienable rights, was intended for human beings and exclusively for human beings, not for entities. So they got that right. They put the power to define and authorize corporations in the hands of the state. So therefore, most of these companies that acquired charters were done so at the state level. Anyway, I digress, which I tend to do a lot. So Move to Amend decided that we need to be on the offensive, to say we want to propose something that we think is going to be commensurate in magnitude, in breadth and depth to the problem. There are folks out there, since the passage of Citizens United back in 2010, folks out there who feel, and because of some weird way, a lot of people feel that the problem began with Citizens United. And I get it. If you haven't been exposed to this whole issue area, and you may think this is when the problem first began of corporations having inalienable rights and money being speech. So if that's sort of your first exposure to it, it makes perfect sense that you would believe that all we have to do is just get rid of Citizens United, reverse it, or make the money more transparent, or some of these other less than full measures. That all we have to do is deal with that, and guess what? We go back to the grand, glorious democratic nirvana we had the day before Citizens United passed. Remember those good old days when our voices were being authentically heard, our needs were being authentically met, and our communities were being authentically helped? No, they didn't exist. Things got worse in Citizens United, but as this other piece says, it goes back a very long way. So our offensive, going on the offense, trying to propose something that we feel is commensurate to the magnitude of the problem, has, if you open this up to the red panel, 2 components. The first this wild and radical notion, right? Only natural persons have constitutional rights. You know, what could be more bizarre than that, right? People are people. Or as David Cobb used to say, if you have a belly button, you have constitutional rights. If not, you don't. I mean, not a bad sort of litmus test. So, that's the basic idea, is that corporations, corporate entities, which we define, you know, corporate entities are not just business corporations, they're nonprofits, they're most labor unions, not all, but many labor unions as well. They all are creations of the state. And we can, and there are certain protections that these corporate entities have via statutes, via laws that I'm sure the senator there knows quite well, because they may be constantly expanding. So the right to sue and be sued, and the right to form a contract and be treated as a unitary actor, those kinds of things that allow businesses to do business, those are not constitutional rights. Those are protections, those are abilities, those are safeguards. Those exist through statute. They have not been anointed to them by courts. That's not what we're talking about. We're saying only human beings should have these basic rights that were instilled in the Bill of Rights and in the post-Civil War amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, and many other First Amendment as well, which is in the Bill of Rights, which we'll get into. So that's one component. The other, which people are much more familiar with, and because many groups are dealing with this, has to do with money not being defined as constitutionally protected First Amendment free speech that applies to not just business corporations, but also human beings. If money is speech, then voila. Those who have the most money have the most speech. Not a real good definition in my way of thinking. You may disagree with that, but not a real good definition of anything approaching a real authentic, again, whatever you want to call it, democracy, self-determination, self-governance, sovereignty. You know, the people on the left call it democracy, people on the right call it sovereignty. In between is self-determination, self-governance, right to decide, whatever you call it. Basic, that ability is inhibited when you have money being defined. It's more like an oligarchy, a plutocracy, a monocracy, all of the above. That's a pretty apt description of kind of what we have, if not exactly what we have today. So we feel both of these are important, and that includes certainly getting rid of Citizens United, all right? But actually the money as speech part didn't begin with Citizens United. It sort of began with this decision, 1976, called Buckley versus Vallejo. The first time that corporations were equated with or individuals and anybody who spends political money on elections having the First Amendment free speech right to do so. Okay? We feel both of these are important, and we, as Move to Amend, give particular emphasis to the first one. And the reason for that is because there are a lot of groups out there that understand, and most people get, right? I mean, you don't have to spend a whole lot of human breath on talking about the corrupting influence of money in elections, whether you call it pay to play, whether you call it legalized bribery, whether you call it capital punishment, meaning those who have the capital do well, those who don't have the capital get punished. Whether you call it the golden rule, he or she who has the gold rules. I mean, whatever you call it. The point being that it's easy to kind of make the case, and a lot of people are making the case and doing so effectively at saying we need to reduce the political influence of money in elections. Now that's taking a variety of different forms. Many of them we believe are not sufficient if they are not going to the root, not just dealing with the totality of Citizens United, but also getting rid of Buckley versus Vallejo, okay? But that's not all that's required. We believe it's particularly important to deal with this corporate constitutional rights. Not only because there is a piece of it that deals with money in elections, okay? As we know, corporations, corporate entities do have the ability not to donate or invest, depending on how you want to look at it, directly in political campaigns. You and I as individuals can donate a certain amount, up to a certain amount per year per election cycle to political campaigns. Corporate entities still cannot donate or invest directly to political campaigns, but they can donate to these groups that are favorable or disfavorable to candidates or to issues. And in fact, the first time corporations won that right was First National Bank versus Bilotti in 1977, where the Supreme Court at that time declared that corporations for the first time have the First Amendment right to be involved in influencing elections, that being ballot issues, okay? Now, if you live in California, you know, every year there's 35 to 85 things on the ballot, and you think, wow, that's really democratic because it's doing an end run, right? Citizen initiatives do an end run around legislation and legislators. But many of those are put on the ballot by corporate interests because they got the money and then they push for them. So is that really doing an end run? You know, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall were considered to be sort of the populist era reforms, and many constitutions, state constitutions, included some or all of those. But when you've got all that money and you can corrupt it, is it really all that democratic? So that's a piece of the corporate constitutional rights, but it's not the only piece. And so just for a minute or two, I want you to pay your attention to this piece. So this is, again, sort of the cliff notes of this timeline, and it addresses, tries to address, seeks to address. Yeah, does everybody get a copy of it? The as you see, sort of the subtitle, the non-First Amendment right to speak. For the most part, decisions, court decisions. There's a few non-court decisions, but not many. In fact, I don't think there are any. Okay, so I want you to focus here on, and there's one of these that pertains directly to your fair state that we'll get to. So we believe it's extremely important that we know about, that we get on the other side of the learning curve, okay? Because if you are unaware of this and these, then it's not an issue. It's not a problem. Then the totality of the issue of the problem only deals with corporate money in elections. That's the beginning and that's the end of the corporate rule, the title of this talk. We the people versus corporate rule, it's up to us. Corporate rule is more than just simply the corruption of elections by corporations and the influence and the lobbying. It has to do with these other parts of the Constitution that have been hijacked or perverted by corporations as a result of activist Supreme Courts, for the most part. Activist Supreme Courts that concocted this notion. I mentioned corporations not mentioned in the Constitution. How did it happen? Right? Courts are supposed to be, what's that thing? They're just supposed to be umpires, not supposed to be players. But they created or concocted basically out of thin air this notion that corporations are persons in a variety of different ways, basically beginning with Dartmouth College versus Woodward, 1819, that equated a corporate charter with a contract. If you recall my babbling or mumbling or whatever it was about a half hour ago, talked about a way that we the people defined corporations was through a charter, a democratic instrument. But if a charter is deemed a contract, by definition a contract, if you know anything about a contract, that's more something kind of between equal parties. One party of a contract can't unilaterally change that quote-unquote contract if it's deemed a contract instead of a charter. Hope you haven't lost me. Sometimes I'm not all that clear. So that's the problem here. So what this happened, as early as 1819, it meant, okay, states could initially issue charters, but if they wanted sort of in the middle of the whole effort to alter it or amend it in some way, they didn't have that unilateral power to do so because it was a contract. So companies could challenge. So it wasn't a constitutional right per se, but there is something called the Contracts Clause of the Constitution that they hung their hat on. And the guy who actually argued this for The College of Dartmouth was a guy maybe you've heard of, Daniel Webster. All right. Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad, 1886. This is sort of when, there's sort of a backstory, not going to get into it, but this is when, for the most part, corporations won, in a weird way, the 14th Amendment due process right. 14th Amendment was one of the post-Civil War amendments. 13th abolished slavery. 14th gave free black slaves due process and equal protection, some other things. And 15th Amendment gave black males, not women, males, the right to vote. Okay? So with a straight face, the courts sort of declared that corporations have 14th Amendment constitutional rights. Rights that were intended for free black slaves, but because of the tax case above, I'm not going to get into it, they were claiming that they were being taxed at an unfair rate compared to people, and therefore they were being, quote, discriminated against under the 14th Amendment. And they argued that with a straight face, and the courts went along with it. So, first time that they won a constitutional right in earnest. Lochner versus New York, 1905. That's sort of a shorthand for something called substantive due process, and what this did during this whole era. It describes an individual case, but also a whole era where various regulations, economic regulations for the most part, that states were passing, okay? These were state statutes, laws that were passed to protect worker health, safety, communities, sometimes the environment, safety measures. All of these regulations were challenged under the 14th Amendment as being discriminatory and were thrown out. So the power and the right to decide at the state level was usurped or preempted by the courts. Hale versus Hinkle, 1906, corporations win Fourth Amendment search and seizure rights. So no longer could there be surprise, regulatory. When we pass a regulation, we want to make sure the workplace is safety. We're going to do a surprise inspection. You can't do that to a person, right? Because we have, as individuals, search and seizure rights. That goes way back. The colonists didn't like the redcoats just forcing their way into people's homes. So that was a real important. That's why it was the Fourth Amendment. But corporations said the state can't come in and do a surprise inspection without notice so that we can clean up our act for that day in terms of workplace violations or environmental violations, then go back to what it was after they left. And they argued and they won. Fifth Amendment is Pennsylvania Coal Company versus Bayhand, 1922. This was an effort. Fifth Amendment, as you may know, as applied to individuals, is the state can take your property if it wants, but it can only do so if it gives fair compensation and if it's for a public purpose. So for a road or highway, something like that, they can take your home, they can take your property, they can take, if you own a golf course, they can take your golf course, but they've got to pay you just compensation for that, and it has to be for a public purpose. Now, over time, what's public purpose, what's fair market value, lots of different interpretations, but that's the idea. Well, in this case, you had homeowners in coal country having their homes sort of collapsing because underneath they were digging for coal. And so when the state passed a regulation saying, no, you can't do that underneath people's homes, they challenged it. And they said that, well, that's not just present, but future profits that we're losing. That's future property profits that we would lose. Now think about it. That's not just something that has past implications, but there are plenty of people these days, maybe you've heard something called climate change, and that one of the concerns about, and I don't like the word change, it's climate catastrophe, that one of the main sources has to do with the burning of fossil fuels. And one of the proposals for dealing with that is keeping those fossil fuels in the ground by these fossil fuel corporations, oil and gas industry that have made hundreds of billions of dollars in profits. But if you in earnest try to advocate to keeping those in the ground, they sure as heck will argue in the courts that that is something that can only be done if you give me just compensation, which is for future profits, which could amount to how many trillions, tens of trillions of dollars. What state can afford that? What government can afford that? Not too much. So we're in a real pickle. International Dairy Foods Association and Amsoy. Remember this one? Any of you? Yeah. So you silly people here in Vermont, actually believing that you could have the right, not even to just prevent, but just to bloody label products that have bovine growth hormones. Believing, rightly or wrongly, that bovine growth hormones provide a potential threat. And if you look at most municipalities, most municipal charters and state law, there's something in there that gives public officials in the home rule communities what's called the police power. The police power, as elected officials, you are sworn to protect the health, safety, and welfare of your residents. And if you don't have that power, then why should you even exist other than determine, when next year's turnip festival is going to be? If that's all the power you have, you shouldn't even be in existence. This is a profoundly important right and power at the local level. But that has been overturned time and again, and this is an example, in this case, where the company said, you are violating my First Amendment right, but not First Amendment political speech, but my right not to speak. Not to speak. So you can get rid of Citizens United, you can get rid of Buckley versus Vallejo. It doesn't touch First Amendment, other parts of the First Amendment, the right not to speak. And how about this last one, more recently? This beauty, Hobby Lobby. Remember that one? Yeah. Where it didn't directly say, but it did uphold this law, existing statute of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And the company argued, Hobby Lobby Corporation, that not just the owners of Hobby Lobby, but the company itself had, with a straight face, again, First Amendment religious rights to deny women contraceptive coverage. So the long and short of it is, and I will close here momentarily, is just to underscore the fact, and I apologize for sort of milking this, no pun intended, International Am Store, no, okay, no pun intended. But I say this and spend a little bit of time on it just to say that, it's important that we change and address the players of the game. Players of the game being people we elect or unelect. And it's important that we pay attention to the plays of the game. Plays being the laws and the rules. And just like in sports, players of the game, you want to have very good players. And you want to have good plays, good strategies, right? And basketball, pick and roll, and all that stuff. But if all you do is address the players of the game or the plays of the game, and you ignore the rules of the game, just as in sports, if one side, say in basketball, can have 7 players and the other side has 5 players, what team is going to win? It's actually miraculous, I believe, that given how many people believe our government is broken. I don't believe it's broken, it's fixed, as in rigged. It's miraculous, actually, that we the people have been as successful as we are and have been throughout time in some of these things, given how the system has been so bloody fixed against us. We've got to change the rules of the game. And that's what we believe this amendment is. And so I just conclude by respectfully challenging all of you to this group here. We didn't block out the Personhood rights in Taiwan. Here is the group on the ground that is involved in this, that's been working, and WILF as well has been working for this. And I should say, WILF, I think you mentioned that you went through this workshop. WILF developed pretty early on a really wonderful 10-session curriculum on corporations and democracy that a lot of people were engaged in when they went through. It's terrific. and Move to Amend used it. And I think it's still on Move to Amend's website. So it's a terrific piece. We have to get on the other side of the learning curve because, as I said in the beginning, I never learned this stuff in school. Most of us haven't learned this stuff in school. So you have been blessed as well as cursed in being exposed to some of the ramblings of what I have said. Blessed in that, hopefully, one or two things might stick. Cursed in that to be responsible people means you need to do something about this. You need to step up. And you need to each one teach one and be engaged. And not believe that change is going to happen by magic, okay? Or that it's going to be done by people we elect. We need to have people, good people on the inside, who are doing what they're doing at that level. But as any responsible public official knows, what makes their job a whole heck of a lot easier is when there's the rabble on the outside that's pushing and creating chaos and mischief making, nonviolent of course, on the outside. And that is where we come in, to become involved and engaged and do what we can. I would love to see RAD become a partner group at this level to Move to Amend. A way that basically means that you're willing to work on this project. Not drop what you're doing, don't drop what you're doing, but to consider, when we're calling, and what we're doing right now is this We the People amendment is not just sort of in theory, it's been introduced in Congress. Last session of Congress, the 115th session, it got 64 co-sponsors. This year, this session, 116th session, we're hoping to get 75 to 80. It's sort of growing a little bit. It hasn't sort of taken off. But we can't perpetually kick the can down the road. Economically, politically, ecologically, at some point, we do reach limits, saturation points, tipping points, where you just can't do anything anymore before something fundamentally alters. And I think, where that tipping point is, when exactly, you can't put the watch or date or calendar on it. But I don't believe we can keep going the way we are. Just politics alone. The discouragement and the sense of belief that the system has been so totally captured by the powers to be is really fundamentally putting a question mark about whether this country still is anything remotely approaching self-deterministic, to the extent it ever was to begin with. So we've got to be involved and engaged. And I'm just going to hand around. So my challenge is, it's a handout. Okay. At the very least, I ask everyone to sign and get on our mailing list so that we can send you info about the We the People Amendment and the stuff we do. But not asking you to start a group here. I think it's more important that you become connected with RAD. But hopefully RAD is interested in working on this issue. I think that would be terrific. So that we're not reinventing the wheel, not creating some competitive group, whatever the case may be, but trying to work in collaboration with this group, and to the extent that WILP is working on the ground on some of these issues as well, trying to form some kind of alliance or coalition. Because this requires groups to become active and engaged. So the only other thing I will say is there are a lot of groups out there that are working on a variety of different things. Move to Amend, is focusing really wholeheartedly on both of these dimensions, disproportionately trying to pay attention to the corporate constitutional rights. But philosophically, we believe that it's extremely important to be and to always be independent. By independent, we mean politically independent, not connected to any political party. Okay? We can't do that if you are going to be a successful group. We, so far, 10 years of existence, have gotten, and many of you have been part of that effort, collective effort, How many communities in Vermont has passed initiatives or town hall meetings? Quite a few.
Now it was 64 initially,
64,
so it's
yeah.
higher now.
So there's
Wow.
about 600 to 700 communities that have weighed in on this. 19 states have weighed in on this. And it's not just sort of the lefties. It's not just the Berkeleys and the Ann Arbors and the like, but 24 communities where I'm from in Ohio have passed this, including several communities, not to be partisan about it because we think this is transpartisan, but several communities that during the election that voted 2-1 for Romney passed this over Obama. So this, and in the same congressional district that elected Paul Ryan, passed this. Now, how people can swear, I don't know, but they did. So this, we believe, is something that does transcend. But the other thing about it, last thing I truly will say, is being politically independent goes hand in hand with being economically independent. We can't, and don't want to come down hard, but I am going to come down somewhat hard on some of those nonprofits out there that are what I call the part of the nonprofit industrial complex. Those who have been tied to a political party, a big foundation, sometimes they're a front for a company. You've seen the whole greenwashing thing, where corporations sort of capture something that looks legit on the surface. You know, Move to Amend is not connected and does not get support financially from super duper wealthy individuals, from corporations, from foundations, from government. We depend on people who believe in us. So if you can help us out, that would be terrific. Any amount, whether it's one time, whether it can be recurring, you know, any amount would be helpful as we try to work hand in hand, hopefully with groups like you here, as well as partners in other states around the country to build a movement that has power. Because it's only going to be a movement that has power that is going to bring change. So I'll
Great.
stop at that, and I'll
Okay.
just pass around something here momentarily. Feel free to be as generous as you can. You know, these tours are paid for basically by, hopefully, what we get from people who attend these events. So help us out if you can, and appreciate your attention, and we can cuss or discuss anything that you're interested in.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, all right. Well, thank you, Greg, for giving us a whole picture of the sweep of the corporate takeover of our government. One question I have is H.R. Resolution 48. Is that still viable? I believe I saw it on the website. That's the one that is proposing an amendment to the Constitution, providing that the rights extended by the Constitution are the rights of natural peoples only. And Peter Welch is not a signer.
Yeah, I'll pass around some pens.
At least he's not on the list. So do you know anything about Peter Welch? Have you? I mean, we only have one representative
You only have
in
one
this,
rep
in this state.
Yeah, if anybody would like to fill out the form, here's a pen. I do not know exactly, but H.R. 48 is that We the People amendment. That is moved to.
Well, so my question here is, who wants to go with me to talk about this to Peter Welch? You can raise your hand now. Will you come with us, Jenny?
Sure.
Okay.
The date
And-
to consider doing that, there's a postcard in the back here.
So, can I say something?
Yeah.
I believe that one of his representatives has indicated that a Article 5 process would not work. Maybe a congressional process for a proposal of amendment would work. So I don't know, but I don't know what fundamental belief there is in his office about constitutional amendment. May not be related to this, it might be just related generally. So that's a good question, we'll ask him.
Can I just briefly comment on this notion of Article 5 convention? For people who do not know, there are two ways to amend the Constitution. One is through going through Congress. It's the way that the 27 amendments heretofore have been amended. You try to get the guys and gals in Congress, both the House and the Senate, 2/3 of them, to be with you on whatever it is. It's happened 27 times, the first 10 altogether. And then 3/4 of the states just have to ratify, right? But there's this other second way that does an end run around going through Congress. If you think Congress is too far gone and forget it, no way in the world, you can bypass them by calling for an issue-specific convention. So you're not opening up the whole bloody thing to, hey, let's sort of look at the Bill of Rights. Why do we need 10? Maybe we just need 2 or 3, okay? Or it can change it around to be something else. That's not what an Article 5 issue-specific convention is. But to enter that, you need 2/3 of state legislatures to say we want a convention. And then whatever they come up with, you see it's related, it's 2/3 calling for the We the People amendment, okay? If they go along with that, then 3/4 of the states then have to ratify. Now, a lot of people are freaked out by the notion of having such a convention, and I get it, particularly given the political constellation these days. May not be in 2019 a particularly good time to be necessarily calling for that, but if it's issue specific, it can't be hijacked. And the other part of it is that if you think about it, even if it is hijacked, it's still whatever they would come out. We're going to call a convention for X, and they come out with Y. It would still have to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, and I don't think many would be very hopeful or very supportive of that.
I mean, I think the tide is changing. And for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez endorsed right to the move to amend just recently.
She did.
So
She
she's starting a movement in that direction. So are there any other questions or that you'd like to bring up? I see way over there.
Yeah, I'll just say Move to Amend is just focusing right now on trying to get it through Congress. And if that doesn't work, then, maybe we'll pursue this other measure.
Greg, I'd like to, is this on?
Yes, it doesn't broadcast, it's just.
Okay, I'd like to make a couple of comments and ask you a question. It's pretty clear, I think, most Americans don't disagree that the very reasons we founded our country over misrepresentation, and we put together our legal system to do a better job, most Americans agree. We don't have to be convinced it isn't working. The polls show it, all kinds of research show it, that Congress is not making decisions in issue after issue after issue that relate to what the broad public wants.
Right.
And so the issue is, it's really broader. We have to amend and strengthen either our Constitution and our statutes in a whole lot of ways to get at the myriad things that are wrong. You're speaking with what we're talking about tonight to only a piece. And we should all remember that 98% of all Americans do not give a dime to any federal political party or candidate. It's astounding. 2% of us give something, and the bulk is coming from the people we're talking about here.
Yeah.
But even before Citizens United, that was happening. Citizens United, if we roll a clock back 8 years, that isn't going to fix it. It was happening back in the 70s and the 80s.
Correct.
And so it has to be much, much broader. And so ultimately, we have all kinds of organizations, each working within their own silo to advance their specific thing. There are several other amendments, as you talked about. American Promise is doing the same thing.
Right.
They're somewhat similar, but until we're all working together and we're working in much more broad ways, we fix one little thing, we're not going to fix the overall problem. So my question is, Greg, what is Move to Amend doing to work in collaboration with other organizations? Because until we have all kinds of organizations marching in the street to fix democracy first, it's the fastest and best way to unlock progress on health care, climate change, all kinds of issues after issues that are being blocked by the system.
Right.
We haven't gotten there yet. And Congress is not very supportive. Our founders believed that they would never move to change the Constitution if we got to this point and they were not serving the interests of the people. That's why they put in the end run that nobody's ready to do. Right. So how are you working to coordinate with other organizations in a broad sense to help us all show up together and argue that fixing democracy is the best way to unlock progress in everything else that's holding us back?
No, it's a very good question, very fair question, very relevant question. A couple of things we're trying to do, and some of them more successful than others. The one is we have an annual leadership, what we call Leadership Summit, a national conference that's combined with a lobby day every year in Washington. There's a postcard in the back there for it if you're interested in getting more information or attending. And at that event, we invite representatives from national organizations that are working on issues that we think intersect with what we're trying to do. Not every issue connects with this, but a whole heck of a lot do. And so, we have panels, plenaries, workshops dealing with a range of topics that we think, and each year is a little different, that we think are particularly hot button issues. So this year, for example, Medicare for all, Green New Deal, are atop the list. We're inviting people from those respective organizations to attend, and let's figure out how we can try to collaborate in lifting up their issue, because their issue, is more in your face. It's easier to personalize, to put a human face on corporate constitutional rights. This has always been a conundrum for people working on campaign finance. Campaign finance reform has always been a hot button. People have always said, oh yeah, I think this is a problem, but they never do much about it because there isn't a direct, link that connects the dot. There's always sort of 2 or 3 steps in between. And so we think corporate constitutional rights is even harder in a sense to put a human face on. So by having these hot button issues and organizations that work on them be represented at this and talk about what they're doing and how it's difficult to achieve Medicare for all and to have an authentic Green New Deal when the political system is been hijacked. So how far really can we get? Using the metaphor of getting around the bases, can we really get beyond first base when, you go after and try to push Medicare for all? Well, like the industry, I think it's number 2. The number 1 industry in terms of buying, renting, leasing, or retaining public officials are the fire industry, finance, insurance, real estate. Number 2 is the medical, pharmaceutical corporations, insurance corporations, medical industry, hospitals and all. When they've got that kind of power, good luck on trying to have something like Medicare for all. You might get it, but it'll be so watered down when those corporate lobbyists get to it that you won't recognize what finally does get passed, but they'll claim, guess what? We have Medicare for all. That's what happens. Stuff gets co-opted out of the wazoo if you don't have sufficient power. So that's one way, by trying to collaborate with groups that we think are addressing issues that intersect with what we're doing and see how they can help us and we can help them. That's one way. The other is to try to work with organizations. Maybe you've heard of H.R. 1, the For the People Act, the very first piece of legislation introduced in the 116th Congress by the Democrats that deal with 3 topics, one of which voting rights, another sort of good government, and third ethics in government. Every Democrat in the House supported this, okay?
Actually not.
Well, there was like one or...
There are many that haven't supported it. It's all Democrats.
It's all Democrats, but not all. That's right.
And even all the Democrats have not signed on.
Yeah, you're right. Right.
And for many, it's an easy sign-on until it gets serious.
That's right.
And they can easily sign on without necessarily...
It doesn't cost them anything. That's right.
They can run on it. But
that's right.
Raise campaign money.
But there's a lot of groups that are hanging their political hat on promoting that, okay? And we think, okay, that's sort of good as far as it goes. It doesn't go all that far, we think. So we are trying to engage with this coalition. And a lot of those groups include, the big groups, Public Citizen, Common Cause, People for American Way. I was on the board, National Board of Common Cause, for a couple of years. elected across the country. And, great people, but they don't go as far as they should on issues. They're one of those sort of inside the beltway that kind of rub shoulders too closely, in my mind, with the Democratic Party. And maybe that's why I wasn't reelected, but anyway, that was the whole thing. But, so there are other ways to try to, but that's one way we're trying to work to try to say, look, you gotta be independent, and that this isn't going as far enough, fast enough as it should. There's much more that we could do if we had more staffing and more time, and it's a resource question too.
Yeah. Are there other questions? Yes.
I probably don't need that.
Yeah, it's for the
Okay.
TV.
Get some,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
so going broadly,
Yep, go ahead.
I have a pretty broad question for
Sure.
you. If you look at the totality of what you want to accomplish, maybe via that chart, what can you see in the future? Let's say all of these are adopted and approved, these changes are made.
Yeah.
How do you see that is going to affect the everyday life of people? And the reason I'm asking this is I'm a little bit concerned. I understand that in April, our debt reached $22 trillion.
Right.
And the Fed is now proposing to sell securities. They're proposing to sell those securities, which has not been done before. Usually the goes back into the system, but that would then take our return interest payments, and they are now in the private sector. That impoverishes the citizens of the nation, the taxpayers, tremendously. And it's, of course, going to just those people who can buy it.
Right.
This is something that may be able to address that. I'm not certain. Haven't really given it much thought. But generally, especially when I speak to folks who are totally unfamiliar with finances and Supreme Court decisions and, quite frankly, aren't very interested, this is a hard thing to explain. So I thought maybe if you could summarize the beautiful things at the end of this rainbow, that might help.
There's been a lot out there, surveys Gallup has done and a variety of others, of saying what are the sort of the main concerns of people right now. And there is a pretty severe disconnect, okay? I'm sorry the senator had to leave because I'm sure she could affirm this. A disconnect between what people want on issue after issue and the kind of policies we have or don't have, okay? And we could just go down the list. We mentioned a couple of them: healthcare, renewable energy. Can we have at least very modest controls about guns? At least some kind of moderate, most overwhelming percentage of people want those kinds of changes, and many others. Well, if this amendment passes, no longer would wealthy individuals have this protective shield that the Constitution provides that gives them the ability to buy, rent, lease, or retain public officials, okay, via money being defined as free speech, okay? And corporations would not have that ability, nor have the ability to overturn democratically enacted laws by going to the courts. This really is, for people, who are our conservative friends, you always say, wow, sounds pretty lefty. How can you ever expect this to pass muster with, again, not to be partisan about it, but I think if you think about it and you look at it, it's quite conservative in that at one time the default was corporations didn't have inalienable constitutional rights. Money was considered property, not speech. It was only the decisions of activist Supreme Courts that shifted the definition of corporations from being subordinate to being equal to or superior to, and money going from property to speech. Those decisions were shifted from originally the legislative arena to the judicial arena. Okay? All this is talking about, all this does. If you look at it, you didn't see any numbers in here, did you? About, well, how much money should be spent in elections? What should be the appropriate role of corporations versus people in our society? It doesn't mention any of that. All it says is no longer are these questions sort of within the domain, like protected in a castle surrounded by a moat with alligators in the moat. Okay. No longer are these questions in the judicial arena. They're being shifted back to the legislative arena where they once were, so that we the people, can go at it, and those we elect, at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level, to decide how much money should people in Burlington who are running for office receive. Should it be private money? Maybe they should all be public financing or some combination. You can start asking those questions and having that discussion and having that debate. Right now, you can't have that debate, because if you try to mandate public financing of elections, as Maine, I was in Maine yesterday, you can't do it, because money is speech. So all this is doing is shifting back from the judicial arena back to the legislative arena, where now we can have that democratic discussion. Very conservative, I believe.
Okay, any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Does Vermont have a chapter?
Vermont does not have a chapter.
Okay, does New Hampshire?
New Hampshire, I was just in Conway, and they are sort of looking
Okay.
to start. And I'm going to Concord tomorrow, and hopefully we can maybe try to get something.
You said you had about 15 chapters around the United States and states?
No, we have about 60 chapters, but the
Okay.
19 states.
Gotcha.
that
That's,
passed.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, 19
19
states.
states,
that passed,
okay.
Including Vermont, and it actually got on the ballot in a number of states, including, Washington, California, but it also passed in the radical bastion of Montana a couple of years ago. So, when it gets on the ballot at the federal level and at the municipal level, it wins. Only one time did it not win, and that's because the language was so convoluted that people didn't know what they were voting for, and generally how it works is if you don't know what you're voting for, you vote no. But when this has been clearly on the ballot, it wins.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So when it does pass on the state level, then what happens with that? I mean,
Yeah.
what's the next step?
It's not like, I wish it was, it's not like there is some automatic trigger. There are some constitutions on this planet that are a heck of a lot more democratic when it comes to amendments. In fact, this professor of constitutional law at University of Virginia, who we had at our national conference last year, said that the U.S. Constitution is, in fact, the most difficult to amend. Now, it shouldn't be the easiest, but it shouldn't be the most difficult either, okay? But to, your point, the idea being that we should do what we can, organize like heck, and try to bring change. And
I mean,
it can only,
once all the, let's say we have, every state passes this.
yeah, it doesn't
Move towards
automatically.
this
No,
anyway,
no.
but it's symbolic, and you can say,
it
okay.
does, yeah. Some other
Okay.
constitutions do have a triggering mechanism where you can have a national referendum, for example. We don't have that. The only way we can do it is basically we either have to get the courts to do it, right? You have to go to court and try to do something, or do this constitutional amendment through one of these two ways. There is no magic number. You never know what that number may be.
Right.
Okay? But all we're trying to do is, it is symbolic. It's creating pressure, but it is, it is providing a message.
Sure.
And we try to say, look, guys and gals in Congress, you've got 19 states. That represents what percentage of the entire population have voted for this. It's time for you to step up.
Exactly, okay.
So the more communities we can do this. But, let me just also say, that's not the only way we're trying to build support for this. We have several what we call caucuses within Move to Amend. A labor caucus, interfaith caucus, arts and culture, and educators that's focused on those particular constituencies. Again, let's be real. To bring about this change is going to be more than just good ideas. There's a whole heck of a lot of good ideas out there. It never sees the light of day because of political power. We have to build political power, and so we think strategically, working with labor, working with people of faith, working with educators, working with arts and cultural creators. I mean, most social movements have had an arts and culture component. I'm glad to say Move to Amend even has a rap song that's been developed. It's pretty cool. I can send you the link to it if you're interested. But we have an arts, besides that, we have an educators caucus that's trying to develop curriculum that we can get into schools that focuses on doing democracy and learning democracy in a time where schools are getting rid of 12th grade problems of democracy or the like. Labor caucus, labor is getting punched in the teeth. And people of faith, these questions of corporate what constitutes a person? We've had some terrific sermons that have been put together by ministers and pastors that have talked about this. Again, it's about changing the culture. The history of social change in this country has always been a combination going hand in hand with changing institutions and changing the culture, changing the narrative. Right now, the narrative is, well, there's nothing we can do about this. We just have to sort of go along and nibble around the edges. Bullshit. We can change the narrative because it wasn't meant to be, and we can make it not to be. And so working with labor is important. Working with people of faith is important, and in all of those communities, we try to get those respective groups to pass resolutions themselves. So even if you're in communities that have passed a municipal resolution, go to your faith community, social action committee, go to your labor union, try to get your teachers union to take a stand. Hundreds have done so. You go to our website, organizations, hundreds of organizations of all types, neighborhood organizations. I would hope you guys, if you've not endorsed passed a resolution, please consider doing so.
Yeah, all right, thank you. Thank you again.
All right.
I'd like to just make some announcements, and maybe there's some other questions you can ask Greg. One of the issues I'm very involved with is keeping nuclear bombers out of Vermont, and we are happy to announce that the Senate Government Operations Committee will be holding a committee hearing on Tuesday afternoon, May 7th at 1:30 in room 11 at the State House. This is a Senate resolution strongly opposing the basing of any nuclear weapon delivery system in the state of Vermont. And following that, on May 8th at 3 p.m., we'll start a 24-hour sitting meditation protest for peace and against the F-35. Sitting meditation means they sit and do not move at all for 24 hours. Only 2 people are doing this. And on May 9th, we will be joining them for 1 hour to sit with them in front of the State House. But this is sponsored by there's a monastery here in Vermont, and there's a few people who are really committed to that kind of action. So any other comments to make, to thank Greg for his inspired
Can I just say on
description?
the table back here is a bunch of freebie materials. There's just one thing, 2 things actually, for sale. We have a video, 28-minute, terrific. It's short, only $5, and we have a stamp, although I guess you have stamps here, you're aware of the stamping. But the other thing is, as was mentioned earlier, POCLAD puts together I put together a couple of calendars. One is a real democracy history calendar that comes out once a week, comes to your email every Monday morning if you're interested. It gives dates and quotes and events of significant things, birthdays, deaths of people related to issues of democracy, money and politics, corporate rule, oppression, a variety of things, so if you're interested in that. And I do put together what's called a monetary history calendar that Robyn mentioned as well, that looks at how money is created, how we need to democratize money, how it's been hijacked by financial interests, and tries to, again, redefine the narrative around money and who should have the power to have their hands on the spigot of money creation. Should it be financial corporations when they create money out of thin air as loans, or should it be we the people? So if you're interested in that, let me know.
Great. Okay, I have a stamp here. I'm going to stamp all my money right now. Anyone wants to use my stamp? This is Stamp Money Out of Politics, and you can buy your own stamp. And where is the bucket to put our checks into? Oh, okay.
Right here. So any forms you filled out, the
Yep.
move to amend forms that Greg passed around, if you fill those out, that and any donations.
Oh, great.
And thank you much.
Here.
And if anybody's interested, I'll put my card on the back table. If anybody's interested, feel free to harass me any day, any hour.